Breaking news tonight. A trade confrontation is forming across North America, and this one doesn't begin on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, or in the bond market. It begins in your kitchen. Former President Donald Trump is signaling that U.S. corn exports could be used as leverage in negotiations with Canada, and Ottawa is responding with a rare, unmistakable refusal. No deals, no quiet compromises, and no treating food supply chains as bargaining chips. Markets are reacting before any policy exists, and that reaction is already sending tremors through agriculture, food manufacturing, energy markets, and household grocery bills. Tonight, this is not just a political story. This is a food system story, and the consequences could unfold over the next 30 days, 90 days, and the next year. Segment 1. What just happened, and why markets moved immediately. On January 18, 2026, during public remarks on trade posture, Donald Trump suggested that American corn exports could become a negotiating tool in talks with Canada. There was no tariff announcement, no executive order, no signed restriction. But markets do not wait for paperwork. They move on expectation. Within hours, corn futures jumped nearly 2.7%, not because harvest conditions changed, but because confidence did. And that distinction matters. Corn is not a side commodity. It is one of the core structural inputs of the modern economy. The United States produces over 15 billion bushels annually, and Canada imports millions of metric tons tied directly to livestock feed, food manufacturing, ethanol blending, industrial processing. When you signal pressure on corn, you are not threatening a shipment. You are threatening a pricing system. Segment 2. Why this timing is so dangerous. This confrontation is emerging at a moment when food inflation is already elevated, averaging over 6% year over year. Families are already stretched. Producers are already operating on thin margins. Small businesses are already sensitive to input volatility. Now layer this on top. USMCA review pressure, high interest rates, tight labor markets, elevated transportation costs. This is what analysts call a confidence-fragile environment. And into that environment comes a signal that a staple crop may become leverage. That is why this story escalated so fast. Segment 3. Ottawa's response. No shakes. Canada's response was immediate and blunt. Officials made it clear. Food supply chains are not bargaining tools. No handshake politics. No quiet backroom smoothing. No accommodation for leverage tactics involving essential goods. That stance has now been labeled in markets as Ottawa's no-shakes position. Not literal handshakes, but a refusal to play the leverage game. On the surface, this signals stability, but beneath the surface it hardens the standoff. And markets hate standoffs. Markets love clarity. Segment 4. How uncertainty becomes inflation. Here is the critical mechanism most people miss. You do not need to restrict supply to create disruption. You only need to create doubt. When buyers fear a squeeze, they don't wait. They hedge. They stockpile. They lock contracts early, often at higher prices. When exporters sense policy turbulence, they raise risk premiums, adjust contract language, delay commitments. That uncertainty becomes price, and price becomes inflation. This is why analysts describe Trump's move as leverage by signal. Segment 5. Why corn is uniquely sensitive. Corn flows into the economy through multiple channels at once. Roughly 40% goes to ethanol, about 36% goes to livestock feed. The rest goes into food processing and exports. That interdependence matters. Squeeze one channel, pressure spills into the others. This is not theoretical. History shows it clearly. During the 2018 U.S.-China soybean conflict, uncertainty alone caused rapid trade realignment, price collapses, emergency farmer support. The lesson wasn't just tariffs hurt. The deeper lesson was this. Policy uncertainty breaks confidence faster than it breaks production. Corn is even more sensitive because it directly touches consumer staples. Segment 6. The 60-90-day window economic data consistently shows that grain price increases push meat prices, dairy prices, egg prices higher within 60 to 90 days, not instantly, but predictably. Think of the food system like a synchronized factory conveyor. Corn is one of the primary gears. Throw even a little sand into that gear, and the system doesn't stop. It jerks, slows, and misaligns. That misalignment shows up later at the checkout counter. Segment 7. This is not just about Canada. The United States accounts for roughly 1/3 of global corn exports. Reliability is part of the product. When buyers in Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia see political rhetoric tied to staple commodities, they don't evaluate it emotionally. They evaluate it as risk. And once supply chains diversify, they do not snap back quickly. Infrastructure follows contracts. Rail schedules follow volumes. Port slots follow reliability. If buyers build alternatives, U.S. exporters can lose market share even if policy never formally changes. Segment 8. The quiet multiplier. Logistics. Corn is not digital. It requires rail capacity, barge scheduling, truck availability, port handling volatility, changes all of that. Transportation pricing shifts. Storage decisions change. Insurance terms tighten. Financing costs rise. This is why analysts are calling the current moment a pre-crisis confidence shock. A shock that hits before a crisis exists, and pre-crisis shocks are harder to reverse. Segment 9. Who gets hit first? American workers and families. Agriculture is not just farms. It is processing plants, transport firms, retail chains, manufacturing hubs. In states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, livestock operations rely on stable feed costs. Analysts warn that even a 10% corn price increase can wipe out margins in feed-intensive businesses. When margins vanish, you don't just see higher prices. You see hiring freezes, overtime cuts, delayed expansion, layoffs that shows up later as tighter supply and higher prices. Segment 10. Small businesses feel it next. Consider a small tortilla manufacturer in Texas. They rely on predictable corn flour pricing. When input costs spike suddenly, they can't raise prices overnight without losing customers. So they absorb losses, or cut hours, or cancel growth plans. One owner says a sudden spike can erase an entire quarter's expansion strategy. That ripple spreads through local economies. Segment 11. Corporate response, and why it still affects you. Large food processors respond differently, but the impact still reaches households. During past volatility episodes, companies delay capital spending, tighten earnings guidance, slow wage growth, increase consumer prices. Stock volatility pushes executives into defensive mode. Defense means cost protection. Cost protection often means price increases. Segment 12. International watchers are paying attention. Canada's stance is refusal, not escalation. But partners like Mexico have historically expressed concern when staple crops become political tools. Asian importers monitor reliability carefully. Once procurement patterns change, they can reshape trade flows for years. Credibility is slow to rebuild. Segment 13. What happens next? 30, 90, 365 days. Short term, 30-90 days. Volatile futures pricing, cautious contracting, wider bid-ask spreads, increased hedging, potential stockpiling distortions, medium term, 6 to 12 months. Importers diversify sourcing. U.S. export demand softens. Domestic pressure for support programs. Trust premium remains damaged. Even if rhetoric cools, risk stays priced in. Segment 14. The bigger question. This story is not about corn running out. It is about whether governments normalize the idea that essential commodities are negotiation tools. If that becomes standard practice, volatility becomes permanent. And in an inflation-sensitive era, volatility is its own tax. Final takeaway. 3 critical points. Signaling alone is already shaking food markets. Ottawa's refusal confirms a standoff market's dislike. The real costs land on families, workers, and small businesses. Food security depends on stability, not brinkmanship. Because in the food system, the bill doesn't arrive in the negotiation room. It arrives at the register.